Have you ever noticed how a relationship can feel like a loop you cannot escape, no matter how much you try? One moment, everything feels warm, close, and full of hope. You feel seen, you feel wanted, you feel like finally, this is it. But then, almost without warning, something changes. The energy shifts, the replies get slower, the warmth fades, and suddenly you are left sitting in silence, trying to understand what went wrong. Again, if this sounds familiar, you are not alone. And more importantly, you are not crazy for feeling this way. There is a reason some relationships feel emotionally unstable, even when love is present. There is a reason why one person seems to move closer when the other pulls away, and pulls away when the other moves closer. This is not bad luck. This is not coincidence. This is a deeply rooted psychological pattern that repeats itself in human connection again and again. Most people enter relationships believing love should feel simple. They think if two people care about each other, things should naturally fall into place. But real emotional bonding is not that clean. It is shaped by fear, attachment, past experiences, and unconscious survival patterns that most people never notice. And when two people with opposite emotional strategies meet, something powerful is created, but also something very unstable. This is what makes the dynamic so confusing, because both people are often genuinely feeling something real. It is not fake. It is not imagined. The connection exists. The emotion exists. But the way each person handles closeness is completely different, and that difference creates a cycle that feels like emotional push and pull, over and over again. One person moves forward when they feel distance. They want reassurance. They want clarity. They want to feel emotionally safe again. And the more uncertain things become, the stronger their need for connection grows. It is not about control. It is about fear of losing something meaningful. When connection feels unstable, the mind naturally tries to fix it by getting closer. But then, something unexpected happens. The other person starts to step back. Not because they do not care, not because they are cold, but because closeness itself starts to feel overwhelming. Emotional intensity begins to feel like pressure. And instead of moving toward that pressure, they move away from it. Distance becomes their way of breathing again. Space becomes their way of feeling safe. And just like that, the cycle begins. One reaches, one retreats, one tries harder, one pulls further. And without realizing it, both people become trapped in a rhythm they did not consciously choose. At first, it does not feel like a problem. In fact, it often feels like chemistry. It feels intense. It feels magnetic. The highs are very high. The lows are very low. And that emotional contrast creates a powerful bond that can feel almost addictive. The brain starts to associate uncertainty with importance. The more unpredictable it becomes, the more attention it demands. This is where most people get stuck without even knowing why. Because instead of stepping back and seeing the pattern, they become emotionally invested in solving it. They start analyzing every message, every silence, every small change in tone. They begin to look for answers in behavior that is actually driven by deeper psychological wiring, not moment-to-moment decisions. And slowly, what started as connection turns into confusion. What started as closeness turns into anxiety. What started as love starts feeling like emotional chasing. The hardest part is that both people usually believe they are reacting normally. The one who moves closer thinks they are just trying to save the connection. The one who moves away thinks they are just protecting their space. Neither realizes they are playing into a cycle that reinforces itself every time it repeats. And this is where understanding becomes powerful. Because once you see this pattern clearly, something inside you starts to shift. You begin to realize that this is not just about one person. It is about a dynamic, a push and pull system that feeds on emotional reaction. And the more you react, the stronger it becomes. But before you can break it, you have to fully understand it. You have to see how it forms, why it feels so intense, and why it keeps repeating even when both people are exhausted by it. And that is exactly what this video is going to take you through. By the end, you will not only understand why this dynamic keeps you stuck, you will also understand what actually breaks it. The shift is not what most people expect, and it changes everything once you see it clearly. Why does your mind feel so restless when someone pulls away, even when you tell yourself to stay calm? It is strange how emotional distance can create such a strong internal reaction. You try to focus on other things, but your attention keeps going back. You replay conversations. You analyze silence. You search for meaning in gaps that were never clearly explained. It feels like your peace depends on getting answers from someone who is not giving them. This reaction is not random. It comes from a deeper wiring in the human nervous system. The brain is built to detect changes in connection. When emotional closeness suddenly decreases, the mind does not interpret it as space. It interprets it as uncertainty, and uncertainty triggers alert mode inside you. In that state, logic becomes weaker, emotion becomes louder, and the need for resolution starts to feel urgent. You do not just want connection anymore. You want relief from discomfort. That is why the urge to reach out becomes stronger exactly when the other person steps back. But here is where the cycle becomes powerful. The more you move toward relief, the more pressure the other person feels. And the more pressure they feel, the more distance they create. It is not planned. It is automatic. Two nervous systems responding in opposite directions without awareness. One is activated by absence. The other is activated by intensity. When absence appears, your system tries to restore closeness quickly. You send messages, you double-check signals, you try to bring things back to normal. But from the other side, those same actions can feel like emotional weight building up too fast. Not because the intention is wrong, but because their internal threshold for closeness is different. So they step back again. And now both people are reacting to each other without realizing they are reacting to fear, not facts. The connection becomes less about understanding and more about managing discomfort. Every interaction starts to carry hidden tension. Even simple communication begins to feel charged. Over time, this creates emotional fatigue. One side feels like they are always reaching. The other feels like they are always escaping. Neither side feels fully understood. Both begin to think something is wrong with the other person, when in reality, both are just operating from different emotional reflexes. The reaching side often begins to believe that effort will solve the gap. They think consistency, patience, and emotional availability will eventually bring stability, so they increase their investment. More attention, more care, more trying to fix what feels uncertain. But emotional systems do not always respond to increased effort with increased safety. Sometimes, effort can feel like pressure when the nervous system is already overwhelmed, and when pressure rises, withdrawal becomes stronger. That is why the pattern becomes self-reinforcing. Every attempt to fix it can accidentally keep it alive. Meanwhile, the withdrawing side is not free from emotional conflict either. Even though they step back, they often do not feel peace in that distance. Instead, they feel temporary relief, followed by a return of curiosity or guilt. But when they sense emotional intensity again, their protective response activates once more. So they stay caught between wanting connection and avoiding overwhelm. This creates an invisible push-pull rhythm that neither person fully controls. And the most difficult part is how convincing the emotional signals feel. The highs create hope. The lows create urgency. This contrast trains the mind to stay engaged. Instead of stepping away, the brain becomes focused on solving the pattern. It starts believing that if it just understands the situation better, it can finally stabilize it. But understanding alone does not stop a reflex cycle. What keeps this dynamic alive is not lack of love. It is mismatch in emotional regulation. One person regulates through closeness, the other regulates through space. So when stress appears, they move in opposite directions. And those opposite movements keep reinforcing the same loop. You start to notice small things becoming emotionally heavy. A delayed response feels like rejection. A simple message feels loaded with meaning. Silence feels like distance growing. And every interpretation becomes more sensitive than the actual situation. This is how emotional imbalance develops without clear events causing it. Nothing dramatic has to happen. The system itself creates tension through repetition. And slowly, both people begin to lose clarity about what they actually feel. They become more focused on reaction than connection, more focused on behavior than presence, more focused on avoiding discomfort than building understanding. At this stage, the relationship stops feeling stable, even when moments of closeness still appear, because the nervous system remembers the cycle more than the connection. It anticipates repetition. It prepares for distance after closeness and pursuit after distance. And this anticipation alone keeps the cycle active. To truly see why this keeps happening, you have to look beyond surface behavior. You have to understand that both individuals are not choosing chaos. They are repeating emotional protection strategies that once made sense in their past experiences. Once this becomes clear, the confusion starts to shift into awareness. And awareness is the first point where change becomes possible, because you are no longer reacting blindly to the pattern. What makes a person start leaning forward emotionally, while another instinctively steps back, even in moments that should feel the same for both? The answer lies in how each mind has learned to interpret emotional closeness over time. Human behavior in relationships is not only shaped by the present moment, it is shaped by memory, conditioning, and early emotional experiences that quietly form internal rules about safety and connection. These rules operate beneath awareness, guiding reactions without permission or discussion. For some individuals, closeness was once unpredictable. Care may have arrived inconsistently, or emotional attention may have depended on behavior, performance, or timing. In such environments, the mind learns a pattern. Connection must be secured, maintained, and sometimes fought for. This creates a strong internal drive toward proximity whenever uncertainty appears. So when emotional signals feel unclear in adulthood, the system does not relax. It activates. It pushes toward contact, toward reassurance, toward restoring a sense of emotional certainty. The goal is not control over another person, but relief from internal tension that rises when connection feels unstable. On the opposite side, another internal system forms when closeness has been experienced as overwhelming, intrusive, or emotionally demanding. In that case, the mind associates intensity with loss of balance. Instead of feeling comfort in proximity, it begins to associate it with pressure on personal space and emotional autonomy. So when connection starts to deepen, the instinct is not to move closer, but to create distance. Not because attachment is absent, but because regulation happens through separation. Space becomes a method of returning to internal calm. When these two systems meet, they do not interpret each other correctly. One interprets space as uncertainty. The other interprets closeness as pressure. Each action from one side triggers a protective response in the other, even though neither side intends harm. This is why communication alone often fails to resolve the tension. Words are exchanged, but the underlying nervous responses remain unchanged. A message meant to reassure can feel insufficient to one person and overwhelming to the other. A pause meant to create comfort can feel like rejection to one side and relief to the other. As this continues, each interaction starts to carry hidden emotional weight. Small behaviors begin to represent larger meanings. A delayed response becomes a signal of withdrawal. A quick reply becomes a signal of pressure. Neutral actions become emotionally interpreted through the lens of past experiences rather than present reality. Over time, both individuals begin adjusting their behavior in response to perceived shifts. The one moving forward increases effort, hoping to restore stability through consistency. The one moving back increases distance, hoping to restore stability through space. Ironically, both are attempting to create balance, yet both actions contribute to further imbalance. This creates a silent negotiation happening beneath every interaction. One side is constantly testing for reassurance. The other is constantly testing for breathing room. Neither test is intentional, but both are continuous. And each test produces a reaction that reinforces the same emotional script. What makes this cycle even stronger is the brain's sensitivity to unpredictability. When emotional responses are not consistent, attention becomes heightened. The mind starts tracking patterns more closely, trying to predict outcomes. This increases emotional focus on the relationship, even when it causes stress. In this state, emotional investment does not decrease tension, it often increases it. Because attention becomes tied not to stability, but to uncertainty. The more unclear things become, the more mentally occupied the situation becomes. This is how emotional dependency on resolution forms. Not because the bond is strong in a healthy way, but because the mind becomes occupied with resolving inconsistency. The focus shifts from experiencing connection to decoding behavior. Meanwhile, each person's protective strategy becomes more rigid. The one seeking closeness begins to act with greater urgency, believing that stronger effort will finally stabilize things. The one seeking distance begins to withdraw more quickly, believing that earlier separation will prevent emotional overload. Both sides begin operating from escalation rather than balance. And escalation deepens misunderstanding. At a certain point, both individuals may start feeling emotionally exhausted without knowing why. They may still care, but the experience of interaction becomes draining. This exhaustion is not caused by lack of compatibility in personality alone. It is caused by continuous activation of opposing regulation systems that never synchronize. Even moments of peace start to feel temporary because the mind anticipates the return of tension. This anticipation prevents full relaxation. The system remains on alert, waiting for the next shift, the next change, the next emotional adjustment that requires reaction. And so the cycle continues, not because either person wants it, but because both are responding exactly as their internal programming dictates. Without awareness of these internal patterns, behavior keeps repeating itself even when intentions change. This is why understanding emotional origin matters. When the source of reaction becomes visible, the automatic nature of behavior starts to weaken. And in that weakening, space for choice begins to appear. Why do two people who genuinely care about each other end up feeling like they are moving in opposite directions, even when neither of them wants distance? This question reveals something important about emotional connection that most people do not notice until they are already deeply inside the pattern. Human relationships are not only shaped by feelings of affection, they are also shaped by internal systems that regulate emotional balance. When those systems are not aligned, connection begins to feel unstable, even if the intention on both sides is sincere. What happens next is not a sudden breakdown. It is a gradual shift in how each interaction is experienced. At first, both individuals still believe they are simply reacting to situations. But over time, reactions start becoming predictable responses to each other's emotional state. Without realizing it, each person starts adapting their behavior based on how the other person is expected to respond. This creates a subtle form of emotional conditioning. One person begins to associate closeness with the need to act more available, more expressive, more consistent. The other begins to associate emotional intensity with the need to step back, slow down, and reduce engagement. These associations are not conscious decisions. They form quietly through repetition. As this continues, the emotional gap between them does not grow because care is missing. It grows because regulation styles conflict. One system attempts to stabilize connection through increased engagement. The other attempts to stabilize through reduced exposure. Both strategies are aimed at restoring balance, yet they pull in opposite directions. What makes this especially difficult is that each person experiences their own strategy as reasonable. The one who reaches forward feels justified because distance creates discomfort. The one who steps back feels justified because intensity creates pressure. From each perspective, their own behavior feels like the correct response to what they are experiencing. This mutual justification prevents reflection. Instead of seeing the pattern as shared, each side starts interpreting the situation individually. The focus shifts toward what the other person is doing wrong, rather than recognizing the interaction loop itself. This is where misunderstanding becomes stronger than intention. As emotional exchanges continue under these conditions, sensitivity increases. The mind begins to detect meaning in small variations. A slight delay is no longer neutral. It is interpreted as emotional shift. A change in tone is no longer just communication style. It becomes a signal of withdrawal or discomfort. These interpretations happen automatically, without conscious effort. This heightened sensitivity creates emotional fatigue, not because something major is happening, but because attention is constantly engaged in interpretation. The brain becomes occupied with reading signals, predicting responses, and preparing reactions. Over time, this creates a feeling of exhaustion that is difficult to explain clearly. At the same time, both individuals begin adjusting their behavior in ways they believe will restore stability. One may increase emotional expression, believing clarity will reduce confusion. The other may decrease emotional exposure, believing space will reduce pressure. Yet each adjustment is met with a counter-adjustment from the other side, reinforcing the same imbalance. This is how the pattern strengthens itself, not through conflict, but through repeated attempts to fix discomfort. Each attempt becomes part of the cycle. Each response becomes fuel for the next reaction. Eventually, emotional experience becomes less about connection and more about management. Instead of simply relating, both individuals begin managing each other's reactions and their own internal responses at the same time. This dual focus reduces presence and increases mental strain. What is often misunderstood in this stage is the assumption that effort alone can resolve the imbalance. More communication, more reassurance, more patience are all commonly tried strategies, but when the underlying regulation mismatch remains unchanged, additional effort does not create stability. It only increases emotional load. This is why the dynamic can persist even when both people are trying to improve it. Improvement attempts are made within the same structure that created the imbalance. Without changing the structure itself, outcomes remain similar. Another important factor is emotional expectation. As the cycle repeats, each person begins to anticipate how the other will respond. These expectations start shaping behavior in advance. Instead of reacting to the present moment, they react to predicted outcomes. This reduces spontaneity and increases tension. In this predictive state, even neutral interactions can feel loaded, because the mind is no longer responding only to what is happening. It is responding to what it expects to happen next. This creates a constant background pressure that keeps the emotional system active. Over time, both individuals may feel stuck, even if they still value the connection. The sense of being stuck does not come from lack of options. It comes from repeated reinforcement of the same behavioral loop. Each cycle strengthens the familiarity of the pattern, making it feel harder to break. And yet, within this repetition, awareness can begin to form. When someone starts recognizing that reactions are part of a pattern rather than isolated events, the emotional intensity of each moment begins to shift. The experience becomes less personal and more observable. This shift in perspective does not immediately end the cycle, but it creates distance from automatic response, and that distance is where change begins to become possible, even if it is not yet fully realized.